The morning sun filtered through the large glass windows of the bustling airport, casting golden streaks across the polished floors. Travelers hurried past with rolling suitcases, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a woman whose presence commanded respect even in the chaos of an early weekday commute. Dressed impeccably in a tailored navy blue blazer paired with black slacks, she carried herself with quiet confidence. Her leather tote bag, slightly worn but well-loved, hung securely over her shoulder, filled to the brim with documents from her recent community event. Evelyn had spent the last 2 days speaking at town halls and meeting constituents in her home state. She'd listened intently as people shared stories about healthcare struggles, education gaps, and economic hardships. It was the kind of work that fueled her passion for public service, though it left little room for rest. Today, however, marked the end of this leg of her journey. With her flight back to Washington, D.C., scheduled to depart within the hour, Evelyn made her way toward Gate 17. As she approached the gate area, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual hum of travelers chatting or scrolling on their phones seemed quieter here, replaced by an almost palpable tension. A young gate agent glanced up briefly before returning to her screen, while another shuffled papers with unnecessary vigor. Normally, Evelyn wouldn't have thought much of it. Airports were stressful places, after all, but there was something different about how they looked at her. Their eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, not out of recognition, but more like suspicion. Evelyn tried to brush it aside. After years in politics, she was no stranger to curious stares. People often recognize her face from news clips or campaign posters, sometimes stopping her to thank her for her advocacy work. But today, none of that happened. Instead, when she reached the counter to present her boarding pass, one of the agents asked her to step aside. "Ma'am, we need to verify your ticket," the agent said curtly, avoiding eye contact. Confused but cooperative, Evelyn began rifling through her tote bag. Between folders stuffed with constituent letters, policy briefs, and receipts from local businesses, finding the small piece of paper felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. "It's here somewhere," she muttered under her breath, smiling apologetically at the agent. Meanwhile, whispers floated around her. One staff member leaned over to another and murmured, "She doesn't look like she belongs." Another nodded, adding, "Maybe she's lost." Evelyn caught fragments of these comments, her stomach tightening. Belong. Lost. These words stung more than she cared to admit. She knew she belonged, not just in this airport, but in every space she entered. As a U.S. Senator, she represented millions of voices, fighting tirelessly for justice and equality. Yet, standing there amidst skeptical glances, she felt reduced to nothing more than a stereotype. Finally locating her boarding pass, Evelyn handed it over with a polite smile. But instead of relief, what came next sent shockwaves through her day, and would soon ripple far beyond the confines of Gate 17. The gate agent scanned Evelyn's boarding pass with deliberate slowness, her eyes flicking between the paper and Evelyn's face. For a moment, everything seemed routine, just another traveler checking in for their flight. But then, without warning, the agent turned to her colleague and whispered something that made both of them glance at Evelyn again. This time, their expressions weren't just curious. They were suspicious. Evelyn felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd been through enough airports in her lifetime to recognize when something wasn't right. The air around her grew heavier as she noticed subtle changes in the way the staff interacted with her. One agent picked up a phone, speaking softly into the receiver while occasionally glancing in her direction. Another scribbled notes on a clipboard, though Evelyn couldn't see what they were writing. Her confusion deepened. What had she done wrong? "Ma'am," the first agent said finally, her tone firmer now, "do you have any other identification on you?" Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the question. "Identification? I already gave you my boarding pass," she replied calmly, though her voice carried an edge of frustration. "Is there a problem?" The agent hesitated before responding. "We're just following protocol, ma'am. Standard procedure." But Evelyn knew better. There was nothing standard about this. No one else at the gate was being asked for extra ID. Families with children, business travelers in suits, elderly couples, all of them were moving freely, unbothered by probing questions or scrutinizing stares. Why then was she singled out? Before she could press further, two uniformed police officers appeared, summoned seemingly out of nowhere. Their presence immediately drew attention from nearby passengers, who craned their necks to watch the unfolding scene. Some whispered among themselves, speculating about what might be happening. Others simply stared, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. "Ma'am, can we speak with you over here?" One officer asked, gesturing toward a quieter corner near the gate. His tone was polite but firm, leaving little room for refusal. Evelyn's heart raced. She wanted to protest, to demand answers, but years of experience taught her that staying composed was key in moments like this. Nodding curtly, she followed them, her tote bag still clutched tightly in her hand. As she walked away from the gate, she caught sight of a few passengers shaking their heads disapprovingly. One woman even mouthed, "This isn't right," though she didn't dare say it aloud. Once they reached the designated spot, the officers wasted no time getting to the point. "Can you confirm your identity for us?" one of them asked, his notebook ready. "I'm Senator Evelyn Carter," she stated plainly, her voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. When the officers exchanged skeptical glances, she added, "I'm a U.S. Senator. You can look me up if you need proof." Instead of acknowledging her claim, the officers pressed on with their line of questioning. "Do you have any government-issued ID with you?" Frustration bubbled beneath Evelyn's calm exterior. Of course she had ID. It was practically part of her job to carry it everywhere. Reaching into her blazer pocket, she pulled out her official Senate badge. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its gold emblem unmistakable. "Here," she said, holding it up for them to see. "Does this answer your question?" For a split second, the officers froze, clearly caught off guard. Then, realizing the gravity of their mistake, they began backpedaling quickly, but not quickly enough to erase the sting of humiliation Evelyn felt. The small holding room near the terminal was cold and sterile, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Evelyn sat on a hard plastic chair, her hands resting on her lap, though her mind was anything but still. The two officers who had escorted her here stood nearby, their expressions uneasy as they flipped through notes and whispered to each other. Every so often, one of them would glance at Evelyn, perhaps expecting her to break down or lash out. But she did neither. Instead, she sat tall, her posture unwavering, her eyes sharp with quiet determination. "Ma'am," one of the officers began again, his tone softer now but still tinged with suspicion, "can you explain why you were unable to produce proper identification earlier?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow, incredulous at the absurdity of the question. "Proper identification? I showed you my boarding pass, didn't I? And when that wasn't enough, I gave you my U.S. Senate ID, a federally issued badge that confirms not only who I am, but also what I do for a living. What more could you possibly need?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken frustration. She knew exactly why this was happening, why she'd been singled out, questioned aggressively, and treated like someone who didn't belong. It wasn't about misplaced papers or forgotten IDs. It was about the color of her skin, about biases that ran deep, even in places where professionalism should reign supreme. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware they were losing ground in this exchange. One of them pulled out his radio and muttered something into it before turning back to Evelyn. "We're just trying to ensure everyone's safety, ma'am. This is standard procedure." "Standard procedure," Evelyn repeated, leaning forward slightly. Her voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. "Let me ask you something. How many white passengers have been pulled aside today because they couldn't find their boarding passes right away? How many of them were brought to a holding room and interrogated like suspects? Because if this is truly standard procedure, Then I'd love to see the statistics. The officers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. They weren't used to dealing with someone who could dismantle their arguments so effortlessly. Most people in Evelyn's position might have crumbled under the pressure, but she wasn't most people. Years of navigating political arenas, facing criticism, and fighting for justice had taught her how to stay composed, even when the world seemed determined to undermine her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers stepped outside to make a call. Evelyn watched him go, her jaw tightening. She hated moments like these, not because she doubted herself, but because they reminded her of how far society still had to go. Here she was, a sitting U.S. Senator, someone who dedicated her life to serving others, yet she was being treated like a criminal because of baseless assumptions. When the officer returned, he looked visibly shaken. "Ma'am, we've contacted our supervisor to verify your credentials," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. "It shouldn't take long." Evelyn nodded curtly, though she didn't feel reassured. Verification was necessary, yes, but the entire ordeal left a bitter taste in her mouth. If her Senate ID hadn't been enough to prove her identity immediately, what did that say about the systems in place? Were titles and accomplishments meaningless unless accompanied by privilege? As the minutes ticked by, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about all the times she'd heard similar stories from constituents. Black men and women profiled at airports, stopped while driving, or questioned simply for existing in spaces where others deemed them out of place. These weren't isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a larger problem. And now she was living proof of it. When the supervisor finally arrived, the tension in the room reached its peak. Evelyn handed over her ID once more, watching closely as the man examined it. His expression shifted almost instantly, from skepticism to shock, then to embarrassment. "Senator Carter," he stammered, "I apologize deeply for this misunderstanding. We'll make sure everything is resolved promptly." But Evelyn wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. The supervisor's apology hung in the air, awkward and insufficient. Evelyn stared at him for a moment, her dark eyes sharp with both anger and resolve. She didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of the situation settle over everyone in the room. The officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence now replaced by obvious unease. Even the supervisor, who had walked in expecting to smooth things over quickly, seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Resolved promptly," Evelyn repeated finally, her voice measured but dripping with sarcasm. "You think an apology fixes this? Do you have any idea what it feels like to be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of your skin?" Her words landed like a punch, silencing the room. No one dared to interrupt as she continued, her tone growing firmer with each sentence. "I'm not just some random traveler. I'm a U.S. Senator. My job is to serve the people, to fight for fairness and justice. Yet here I am, sitting in a cold holding room, being questioned like I've done something wrong. All because someone decided I didn't look like I belonged." She paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Despite her composure, the frustration simmering beneath the surface was undeniable. "And let's be clear," she added, leaning forward slightly, "this isn't about me. This happens every day, to black men, women, children, all across this country. People judge not by their actions, but by stereotypes and assumptions. So don't tell me you're going to resolve this. What you need to do is explain why it happened in the first place." The supervisor opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly unsure how to proceed. He glanced at the officers, who looked equally lost. None of them had anticipated Evelyn's reaction, or the depth of her determination to hold them accountable. Finally, after a long silence, the supervisor cleared his throat. "Senator Carter, I assure you that this is not reflective of our policies or values. We'll conduct a full review of today's incident and ensure proper training is provided to prevent something like this from happening again." Evelyn crossed her arms, unimpressed. "Training? That's your solution. Training doesn't fix systemic issues. It doesn't address the biases that led to this moment. If you want real change, you'll need to dig deeper than a few PowerPoint slides. Her sharp critique left the room quiet once more. For the first time, the officers and the supervisor seemed genuinely rattled, not just by Evelyn's words, but by the realization that they were complicit in perpetuating a broken system. They weren't bad people, necessarily, but they were part of an institution that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. After a beat, Evelyn stood up, smoothing her blazer as she did so. She wasn't interested in staying in that room any longer. "Here's what's going to happen next," she said, her voice firm and commanding. "You're going to document everything that occurred today. The questions I was asked, the way I was treated, the assumptions made about me. And you're going to send me a detailed report within 48 hours. In the meantime, I'll be speaking publicly about this incident, not because I want revenge, but because the world needs to understand how deeply rooted these problems are." With that, she turned on her heel and headed for the door, leaving the three men scrambling to catch up. One of the officers called after her, offering another weak apology, but Evelyn ignored him. She had bigger plans now, plans that went far beyond this airport or this single incident. As she walked back toward the gate area, passengers who had witnessed parts of the ordeal clapped softly, murmuring words of support. A few even approached her to shake her hand or thank her for standing up against injustice. Evelyn offered polite smiles, though her mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about using her platform to shine a light on the inequalities that plagued society and demanding accountability from those who claimed to serve it. Little did she know, her story was about to take flight in ways no one could have predicted. By the time Evelyn reached the gate, her phone was buzzing nonstop. Notifications flooded in from every direction. Text messages, emails, and social media alerts lighting up her screen. At first, she assumed it was just colleagues or friends checking in, but as she glanced at her phone, she realized something much bigger was unfolding. A video of the incident had surfaced online, filmed discreetly by a fellow passenger who had witnessed the entire ordeal. The clip showed Evelyn standing calmly yet resolutely as the officers questioned her, their skeptical expressions contrasting sharply with her dignified demeanor. The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, hashtags like #RespectBlackLeaders and #StopRacialProfiling began trending across platforms. People from all walks of life voiced their outrage, sharing personal stories of similar experiences while calling out systemic racism in the aviation industry. Supporters praised Evelyn for handling the situation with grace under pressure, while critics accused the airline of gross negligence. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, turning what started as a private humiliation into a national conversation. Evelyn knew this kind of attention could either overwhelm her or empower her, and she chose the latter. Sitting in the airport lounge, waiting for her delayed flight, she opened her laptop and began drafting a statement. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, fueled by a mix of anger and determination. She wanted to make one thing clear. This wasn't about revenge or shaming individuals. It was about exposing a flawed system and demanding meaningful change. When her plane finally touched down in Washington, D.C., reporters were already camped outside the terminal, microphones and cameras at the ready. Evelyn stepped off the aircraft with the same poise she'd shown throughout the ordeal, ignoring shouted questions until she reached a designated press area. There, surrounded by flashing lights and eager journalists, she delivered a powerful message. "This isn't just my story," she began, her voice steady and commanding. "It's a reflection of a much larger issue, one that affects millions of people every single day. What happened to me at the gate wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of systemic bias that continues to marginalize Black Americans and other communities of color." She went on to describe the details of the encounter, emphasizing how even her position of authority hadn't shielded her from discrimination. "I'm a U.S. Senator," she said, pausing for effect. "If this can happen to me, with my credentials, my visibility, my accomplishments, imagine what happens to those without the same privilege. Imagine the countless individuals who faced prejudice daily, often without anyone noticing or caring. Her words struck a chord. Across the country, people rallied behind her, organizing protests outside major airports and flooding airlines' social media pages with demands for accountability. Grassroots organizations amplified her call for reform, urging lawmakers to address racial profiling in transportation systems. Meanwhile, celebrities and public figures joined the chorus, using their platforms to amplify Evelyn's voice. But not everyone supported her cause. Critics argued that the incident was blown out of proportion, suggesting that Evelyn was exploiting the situation for political gain. Some conservative commentators dismissed her concerns as identity politics, accusing her of playing the victim. Rather than letting these attacks derail her, Evelyn leaned into them, recognizing that pushback was inevitable when challenging entrenched power structures. That evening, as she prepared for a congressional hearing scheduled for the following week, Evelyn reflected on the whirlwind of events. She felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Exhaustion from reliving the painful experience and defending herself against baseless accusations. Exhilaration because she knew this moment mattered, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible or unworthy due to the color of their skin. As she closed her laptop and turned off the bedside lamp, Evelyn reminded herself why she entered public service in the first place. This fight wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who believed in justice, equality, and dignity for all. And she wasn't about to back down now. The next morning, Evelyn stood in front of a packed room at the Capitol, surrounded by a diverse group of lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and community advocates. The energy in the space was electric, charged with both anger and hope. Cameras flashed as reporters jockeyed for position, eager to capture every word she said. This wasn't just another press conference. It was the launch of something bigger, something transformative. Evelyn stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. She adjusted the microphone slightly before beginning, her eyes scanning the crowd. Yesterday, she started, her voice resonant and clear. I shared my story, not because I wanted sympathy, but because I believe that personal experiences can spark systemic change. She paused, letting her words sink in. Then, with deliberate emphasis, she continued, "What happened to me at the airport wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of racial profiling, bias, and discrimination that has no place in our society. And if we don't confront it head-on, it will continue to harm countless individuals." With that, Evelyn unveiled her plan, the Equity in Air Travel Act. The proposed legislation aimed to hold airlines accountable for discriminatory practices while mandating comprehensive training programs for employees. It also called for the creation of an independent oversight board to investigate complaints and ensure compliance. Most importantly, the bill sought to empower passengers by giving them recourse when they experienced prejudice during travel. This isn't about punishing airlines, Evelyn clarified, addressing potential critics directly. It's about creating accountability. For too long, companies have hidden behind vague statements of regret without making meaningful changes. That ends now. Her speech struck a chord with those in attendance. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle nodded in agreement, some even approaching her afterward to express interest in co-sponsoring the bill. Civil rights leaders praised her courage, calling the initiative a critical step toward dismantling institutional racism. Even airline executives, who had initially downplayed the incident, scrambled to issue stronger apologies and pledge support for reform. But Evelyn didn't stop there. Later that day, she held a private meeting with representatives from major airlines, demanding concrete action rather than empty promises. When one CEO offered a generic statement expressing deep regret, Evelyn cut him off mid-sentence. "Regret isn't enough," she said firmly. "Show me your plan. Show me how you're going to train your staff, review your policies, and prevent this from happening again." Her directness left no room for evasion. By the end of the meeting, several airlines had committed to revising their diversity training programs and implementing stricter anti-discrimination measures. While Evelyn knew these steps were only the beginning, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of optimism. Change might be slow, but it was possible, and she was determined to keep pushing forward. That evening, as Evelyn reviewed feedback from the day's events, she received a message from a young woman named Maya. Attached to the email was a photo of Maya holding a sign that read, "Black leaders deserve respect." In her note, Maya thanked Evelyn for standing up not just for herself, but for people like her, young black women who often felt unseen and unheard. Reading the message brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. It reminded her why this fight mattered so deeply. Yes, the road ahead would be challenging, filled with resistance and setbacks. But every time someone spoke out, every time someone stood up against injustice, the world moved one step closer to fairness. And Evelyn, she was ready to lead the charge. As the weeks passed, Evelyn's fight gained momentum. But it wasn't without its challenges. While many rallied behind her cause, others pushed back with surprising ferocity. Conservative pundits took to television screens and op-ed columns, accusing Evelyn of exaggerating the incident for political gain. It was just a misunderstanding. One commentator argued on a popular morning show. Why turn this into a national spectacle? Another dismissed her efforts as divisive, claiming she was exploiting race to score points with voters. Social media became a battleground. Supporters flooded platforms with messages of solidarity, sharing stories of their own encounters with racial profiling. Hashtags like #StandWithEvelyn trended alongside calls for reform, but the backlash was equally fierce. Trolls unleashed hateful comments, questioning Evelyn's credibility and mocking her stance. Some even suggested she was overreacting, implying that if she'd simply complied more quickly, none of this would have happened. Despite the negativity, Evelyn refused to let the criticism derail her mission. She knew pushback was inevitable when challenging deeply ingrained systems of power. Instead of engaging directly with detractors, she focused on amplifying voices that mattered, those of everyday people who had faced similar injustices. At town halls and community forums, she invited individuals to share their experiences, giving them a platform to speak truth to power. One such event took place in a packed auditorium in Chicago. A young man named Marcus recounted being detained at an airport because his name matched someone on a watch list. "They made me miss my flight," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "All because I fit the description. What does that even mean? Am I supposed to change how I look?" The audience erupted in applause, moved by his courage. Moments like these fueled Evelyn's determination. She understood that while her story had drawn attention, countless others remained untold. Her goal wasn't just to pass legislation. It was to ensure no one else felt diminished or dehumanized because of prejudice. Slowly but surely, progress began to take shape. Several major airlines announced updates to their employee training programs, emphasizing cultural sensitivity and bias awareness. One carrier went a step further, partnering with civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle expressed growing interest in Evelyn's Equity in Air Travel Act, signaling bipartisan support. Still, resistance lingered. Some industry leaders argued that additional regulations would burden airlines already struggling post-pandemic. Others claimed existing measures were sufficient, dismissing calls for reform as unnecessary. When questioned during a televised interview about why airlines shouldn't be trusted to self-regulate, Evelyn didn't mince words. "Because trust must be earned," she shot back. And right now, the evidence shows they're failing. Her unapologetic stance resonated with many but alienated others. Critics accused her of being too confrontational, warning that her approach could harm relationships between lawmakers and corporate stakeholders. Yet Evelyn remained steadfast. "If standing firm means holding people accountable," she told a reporter later, "then so be it." Change doesn't come from tiptoeing around discomfort. Amid the chaos, moments of encouragement kept her going. Letters poured in from constituents thanking her for championing justice. Young activists reached out, inspired by her resilience. Even former skeptics began acknowledging the validity of her concerns. Though the journey was far from over, Evelyn could see glimmers of hope breaking through the clouds. Late one evening, as she sat reviewing drafts of the proposed bill, Evelyn allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road ahead would undoubtedly be rocky, filled with obstacles and opposition, but every protest, every shared story, every new ally reminded her why this fight was worth it. For every person who felt unseen, unheard, or undervalued, she vowed to keep pushing forward. This wasn't just her battle. It belonged to everyone demanding dignity and respect. And Evelyn Carter wasn't about to give up now. Months had passed since the incident at the airport, but Evelyn's resolve had only grown stronger. Standing before Congress on a crisp autumn morning, she prepared to deliver what would become one of the most defining speeches of her career. The room was packed. Lawmakers, journalists, and activists filled every seat, their eyes fixed on her as she approached the podium. This wasn't just another legislative debate. It was a moment that could shape the future of equality in air travel. Today, Evelyn began, her voice steady and commanding. We are here not just to discuss a bill, but to confront a legacy of bias and exclusion that continues to haunt our society. She paused, letting her words resonate. What happened to me at that gate wasn't an isolated event. It was a reflection of systemic issues that affect millions of people every day. It's time we stop pretending these problems don't exist and start working together to fix them. As she spoke, Evelyn wove personal anecdotes with hard data, painting a vivid picture of the discrimination faced by Black travelers and other marginalized communities. She shared stories from constituents who had been profiled, detained, or humiliated while simply trying to board a plane. Each story added weight to her argument, underscoring the urgent need for reform. Her passion was palpable, and it didn't go unnoticed. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle nodded in agreement, some even rising to applaud when she outlined specific provisions of the Equity in Air Travel Act. The bill called for mandatory bias training for airline staff, independent oversight boards to investigate complaints, and penalties for companies that fail to comply. Most importantly, it empowered passengers to hold airlines accountable without fear of retaliation. When Evelyn concluded her speech, the chamber erupted in applause, a rare bipartisan show of support. But she knew passing the bill was only half the battle. True change required more than signatures on paper. It demanded a shift in mindset, a collective commitment to treating everyone with dignity and respect. In the weeks that followed, the legislation gained traction, earning endorsements from advocacy groups and industry leaders alike. Airlines began rolling out updated policies, some even inviting Evelyn to consult on their implementation. Though progress was slow, the momentum was undeniable. Outside the halls of Congress, Evelyn's story continued to inspire. Schools invited her to speak about resilience and leadership, while grassroots organizations used her example to mobilize communities. Young activists looked to her as proof that standing up against injustice, no matter how daunting, could spark meaningful change. Reflecting on the journey, Evelyn felt a mix of pride and humility. She knew the fight was far from over. Racism and bias wouldn't disappear overnight, but she also recognized the power of persistence. Every small victory, every new ally, brought them closer to a world where no one would be judged by stereotypes instead of character. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing letters from supporters, Evelyn came across a note from a young girl named Eva. "Thank you for showing me that I can make a difference," Eva wrote. "You're my hero." Smiling softly, Evelyn tucked the letter into her desk drawer, a reminder of why she fought so hard. For Evelyn Carter, this wasn't the end of the road. It was a milestone in a lifelong mission. She had turned indignity into empowerment, using her platform to amplify voices often ignored. And though challenges lay ahead, she faced them with unwavering determination. After all, history wasn't written by those who stood aside. It was shaped by those who dared to stand up.